Israel may have just seized control of South Africa's offshore energy sector, and the left is losing it. While the ICJ case proceeds and certain politicians in South Africa continue their anti-Israel rhetoric, what some of them may have not taken note of is the fact that Israel has had an increasing influence over South Africa's economy in an incredibly good way. You see, not only has Israel relied on South Africa as being its largest exporter of coal, but Israel appears to be increasing the amount of innovations that it shares with South Africa, as well as getting more and more stakes in South African projects, particularly in the energy sector. Now, of course, this has drawn the ire of certain South African politicians, with one EFF member, Karel Niehaus, expressing his frustration with Israel's involvement in the South African economy. But something that he and the rest of the EFF are probably dreading is that Israel is playing an increasingly important role in actually supporting the South African economy. Now, before we get into this intriguing story, could I please remind you to subscribe to the channel if you haven't already? It's completely free to do, and all you've got to do is click on the subscribe button below the video. If you would like to support the channel and enjoy additional benefits such as members-only videos, you can do so by becoming a Power Club member. All you have to do is click on the join button below. Now let's get started. So the story at hand revolves around Navitas Petroleum, which is an Israeli company which is not only seizing a large share in a very important offshore block in South Africa, but also happens to be the operator of this block, provided that the deal goes through. And so here we have a press release from Navitas themselves explaining exactly what happened. So Navitas Petroleum strengthened its presence in the South Atlantic after signing a definitive agreement with Eco Atlantic to acquire a 37.5% operating stake in South Africa's Block 1 CBK offshore. The transaction will allow the Israeli company to become the operator of the asset located in the Orange Basin, one of the most active exploration regions on the African continent. The agreement is part of a strategic framework established between both companies in December 2025 and reinforces Navitas' regional expansion within the offshore oil and gas segment. The transaction includes an initial payment of $4 million to Eco Atlantic, and Navitas will also finance part of the exploratory work program with a net financial commitment of up to $7.5 million for Eco. So the press release explains how the Orange Basin has become one of the most active areas for offshore oil and gas exploration in southern Africa due to several recent discoveries in Namibia and South Africa. With this acquisition, Navitas expands its deepwater asset portfolio and strengthens its growth strategy in the South Atlantic. We also see how Gil Holtzman, the president and CEO of Eco Atlantic, highlighted that Navitas' entry will accelerate the development of the South African bloc and expand technical cooperation between the two companies. So while the entry of Navitas actually provides a lot of good news for South Africa, specifically around, firstly, developing offshore natural gas resources, secondly, actually facilitating the possibility for South Africa to have more sales of natural gas and therefore bring in more money into the economy, and thirdly, supply more local jobs, certain people in South African politics have decided to air their opposition, most notably Karel Niehaus, an MP of the EFF. And so he decided to take to IOL and write an opinion piece titled "Zionist Apartheid Israel has no place in our waters or our economy. Stop Navitas Petroleum now." So personally, I don't see the need to go through this entire op-ed that he wrote. You can find it in IOL if you so choose. But ultimately, it's just the usual talking points of how Karel Niehaus and the EFF and other like-minded people are just completely against Israel and refuse to allow them to operate in the country, even when it actually is to the benefit of South Africans and the South African economy. Now, despite the EFF and Karel Niehaus's protests, it does seem as if this deal is going to go ahead. And the SA Jewish report explains how, despite the diplomatic opposition to Israel, it seems as if South Africa is not yet ready to cut ties with the country economically, given its strategic importance. So, Benji Schulman, who is the executive director of the Middle East Africa Research Institute, made a very interesting observation. He explained that even government ministers who are connected to the African National Congress have said that they don't wish to interfere with the trade relations between the two countries. Furthermore, on the 17th of July, President Cyril Ramaphosa described the West Coast's Orange Basin as one of the world's most promising new energy frontiers. He was speaking at the fourth session of the South Africa-Namibia Binational Commission in Pretoria. Ramaphosa said the basin's development presents us with an opportunity not simply to extract oil and gas, but to establish an integrated regional energy economy encompassing exploration, engineering, refining, petrochemicals, logistics, maritime services, and advanced manufacturing. And this really does fall in line with what I explained. If Navitas does indeed become the operator of the block, which does seem quite likely at this moment in time, then what will essentially happen is that the project itself will be advanced, exploration will get underway. There's a very good chance that local jobs will be created because, after all, engineering, transportation, and other logistical activities will most likely require South Africans in order to, carry out these operations. Furthermore, as mentioned before, any natural gas that is discovered and extracted will essentially result in sales. Not only will South Africa be able to increase its own stockpile of natural gas, but it may be able to export natural gas to other countries as well. And even Ramaphosa seems to understand this. But beyond just this one specific energy project, we actually see that Israel, on a broad scale, has been crucial when it comes to keeping the South African economy afloat. You see, Benji Schulman, with his observation, was onto something incredibly important, and it's actually something that ANC ministers seem to have taken note of. You see, Israel is playing an incredibly important role in maintaining South Africa's economic direction and actually ensuring that the South African economy is able to float rather than sink. And I actually have the data to prove this. While the ANC seems obsessed with aligning with Russia, China, and BRICS nations and further antagonizing the West, what we actually see when we look at SARS official data is that South Africa's trade balances with Western-aligned countries are far healthier than those in the global South. So here I've created a table showing just how much more beneficial South Africa's trade relationship with the United States is when compared to China and Russia. So starting off the bat, we see that the trade balance with China is the largest of any country. But what we see pretty early on when looking at these figures is that it's not the most beneficial relationship to South Africa. You see, if we take a look at export volumes, we see that over 63 billion rand worth of products are exported from South Africa to the United States. Sure, this figure is 100 billion rand when it comes to China, and then of course Russia is only standing at a little over 2.3 billion rand. When it comes to imports, however, we start to see why the US relationship is far more beneficial than the Chinese relationship. You see, South Africa imports around 59 billion rands worth of products from the United States, and this leaves South Africa with a trade surplus of over 4 billion rand, meaning that South Africa sells more products to the US than they buy from the US. If we take a look at China, sure, they may have over 100 billion in exports, but overall, South Africa has a massive trade deficit of over 75 billion rand. And this is ultimately because China sells a lot more products to South Africa than South Africa sells to China. When looking at the trade relationship with Russia, it's highly negligible, with a deficit of around 1.3 billion rand. And so ultimately, both China and the United States greatly dwarf Russia. Now, before I explain just why the United States trade relationship is so much better for South Africa than China, I want to show you another interesting statistic. Israel and Iran have been logging heads, especially in recent times since the war which started in March, and while South Africa seems to have taken the side of Iran, this is a very poor decision, because let's just take a look at the trade relationship that South Africa has with these two countries at the moment. You see, exports to Israel have been over 2.8 billion rand, whereas there's only been around 6.8 million rand of exports to Iran. Imports from Israel have totaled around 1 billion rands worth, whereas there's only around 14 million rands worth imports from Iran. And so the trade balance with Israel is a surplus of 1.7 billion rand. With Iran, however, it's a deficit of just 7.5 million rand. And so yet again, we see how the Western ally, Israel, has a much larger trade relationship with South Africa than Iran. And let's just put that into perspective. Israel is a country of around 10 million people. Iran has over 90 million people. Yet because of Israel's technology and innovation, they have far more to offer South Africa than Iran currently does. In fact, we even see, when comparing to Russia, how Israel's trade balance with South Africa is larger than Russia's trade balance with South Africa. It just so happens that, yet again, the ANC seems to be prioritizing its strange communist ideology above economic practicalities. So remember how I said that we need to explain why the United States trade relationship with South Africa is better than that of China? Well, it's for a very simple reason. You see, the United States imports many more South African products than what they export to South Africa. Hence why South Africa has a trade surplus, right? And this is for a very simple reason. You see, the United States views South Africa as a very cheap supplier of high-quality goods. It acknowledges that South Africa has a lot of important raw materials, as well as finished products. These could include fresh produce, but also textiles and even automobiles. And so what has the United States done? They've said, right, we see that South Africa is a very lucrative seller of many products and services that we want, and so we will buy products from South Africa because we know that buying from South Africa is cheaper than making them at home. After all, America has a much higher cost of living than South Africa, and not only are salaries in America far more expensive, but because overhead costs such as rent are more expensive as well, the Americans understand that they cannot produce products at the same price that South Africa can. And for that reason, it views South Africa as a strategic partner and specifically a seller of cheaper products that they cannot produce for such a low cost at home. When we take a look at China, however, we see that the Chinese are trying to occupy the same space that South Africa is trying to occupy. You see, the Chinese also operate with large economies of scale, and because they're able to produce products for a very cheap price, well, they don't want to buy cheap products from South Africa. They want to be the ones who sell those cheap products to other countries. And so while, sure, China will buy certain products from South Africa, they prefer to be the net sellers to South Africa and other countries. Hence why South Africa has such a massive trade deficit with China. And so overall, what we see is that the United States and Israel fill a certain role in the South African economy that China and other global South allies simply cannot fill. Thank you very much for tuning into this video. If you enjoyed it, please remember to subscribe to the channel for more content. Until next time, I'm Matthew Cohen, and this is the Power Pod.